give it our best shot. I was noting that it's well established that exposure to chemicals can contribute to or worsen diseases. I'm not going to go through this entire list, but if you go to the Centers for Disease Control Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Research, ATSDR, they actually have a document listing all of these contributors to various respiratory, renal, cardiovascular, and other diseases. They don't have a listing at this point for Parkinson's, but through our research, we have learned that in addition to paraquat, rotenone, which is widely used to control seaweed, trichloroethylene, TCE, which is widely used in places like dry cleaners, heavy metals, burn pits, which are common in the Middle East. During our military interventions in the Middle East, there's increasing evidence that burn pits and the chemicals from those burn pits contribute to Parkinson's, and that obviously relates to exposures of service members and first responders. So we are working to prevent Parkinson's by eliminating environmental triggers, and we are engaging the federal government to do much more in this area, both with a specific Parkinson's research program at the Department of Defense, but also through the NIEHS, the National Institute on Environmental Health Sciences. That is the institute at the NIH focused on issues like environmental triggers. And we have been engaging them increasingly. And in the current session of Congress, we actually got some language in a funding bill that would require the NIEHS to take a much more comprehensive research approach to the issues pertaining to Parkinson's, including all of those elements that I just mentioned. Just a quick timeline on paraquat. It was originally approved for use back in 1961, but by 1998, there were already studies linking paraquat to Parkinson's, which by roughly 10 years later, resulted in the European Union banning the use of paraquat. So the EU has banned paraquat for a long time now. By 2009, there were studies that showed a dramatic increased risk of Parkinson's due to paraquat exposure. And 2 years later, another study showed a 250% increased risk. By 2012, there was a study that showed that the risk of Parkinson's was 11 times higher for those people working with paraquat, which probably led in part to China, the world's largest nation, and the country that ChemChina is based out of. And ChemChina is one of the companies that manufactures paraquat. So they don't even allow paraquat to be used in their own country. And over 50 countries out of the roughly 200 countries in the world have banned paraquat by this point. We got involved starting in early 2017 when one of our Unified Parkinson's Advocacy Council members contacted us about paraquat. We did the research necessary, which led to us submitting a formal position to the EPA urging that they not re-register paraquat. In addition to that, we had a change.org petition that got over 100,000 signatures urging the EPA to ban paraquat, which they did not. By 2019, a couple years later, there were additional studies connecting paraquat to Parkinson's, so we submitted a follow-on document to the EPA. Also in 2019, legislation was introduced in the House that would specifically ban paraquat, the Protect Against Paraquat Act. And by 2020, there is a much more comprehensive pesticide reform bill called the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act that was introduced initially in the Senate and then in the House. Since those bills were introduced, the EPA last summer in 2021 decided to re-register paraquat, and it was after that that the Fox Foundation joined a lawsuit being brought by Earth Justice against the EPA, and I'm going to defer questions about that to our friends at Earth Justice if there are specific questions about the litigation. And then most recently, last fall, Senator Cory Booker reintroduced the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act. And just very quickly on that, that bill does specifically ban paraquat, which is a great thing, but it is a much more comprehensive pesticide reform bill that is urgently needed in this country. It would revise our pesticide approval process to make it more like the European Union, which puts human health as a major priority, not a sub-priority. It would also immediately require the EPA to re-evaluate, I think, 72 chemicals, pesticides, herbicides that are currently banned in the EU, but are actively being used in the United States. So this is a very comprehensive reform proposal. We're under no illusion that it's going to pass for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons for this webinar, and something we all need to do, is dramatically increase our education of the American people about the problems around pesticides in this country and the resulting negative impact on human health. Here's a map that shows that paraquat is widely used in the United States. In California, where you see the heavy concentration, that's known as Parkinson's Alley, because the prevalence and incidence of Parkinson's is significantly higher in those areas. Related to this is our push to create state Parkinson's disease registries where we can collect population-wide information on Parkinson's patients. For a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that then researchers can zero in on some of these areas and do epidemiological research in the more heavily concentrated areas where paraquat is being used. What can you do? That's always a question on webinars like this. One, you can join our advocacy efforts. We get nowhere with just a few voices, but we can make some real change if we get hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people engaging with us. So there's a link here, michaeljfox.org/advocacy, that will enable you to sign up to get our advocacy alerts. Also related to this is more research. We have the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, and signing up to participate in that research, whether you have Parkinson's or not. We're looking for people that don't have Parkinson's as well. But that too could lend significant progress in research around use of pesticides and other chemicals. Then finally, if you believe that your Parkinson's is related to paraquat or any other environmental triggers, we want to hear your story. Your stories really enable us from a policy standpoint to put a face and a something memorable in front of lawmakers. So feel free to email us at policy@michaeljfox.org. And my final note here before I turn it over to Jonathan is, I mentioned the Unified Parkinson's Advocacy Council. A lot of you may not know what that is, but that is a council that the Brian Grant Foundation, along with roughly 23 other Parkinson's organizations from throughout the United States, are a part of. And it's our effort as a collective group of Parkinson's organizations to speak with one voice on public policy issues. So we're proud to have Brian Grant Foundation to be a part of that and appreciate this opportunity. With that, I am going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Jonathan.
I will unmute. Thank you, Ted, and thanks to the Brian Grant Foundation for having us here today. As mentioned, I am John Kalmuss Katz. I am a senior attorney with Earth Justice's Toxic Exposure and Health Program. And today I'm going to be discussing the regulation of non-pesticide chemicals, and chemicals in particular that are related to Parkinson's disease. So let me my presentation and see whether I can, there we go. It's coming up on my screen, so I'm going to hope that.
It's coming up for me too.
Great, thank you. So I can go past this slide. Oh, sorry. First, how are chemicals regulated under federal law? And there are really three main laws that do that. And here I'm not discussing kind of the releases of chemicals to specific environmental medium like the air and water. You have laws like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act that regulate that. These laws that are mentioned on this slide regulate the manufacturing of the chemical or the pesticide, and they have the potential to restrict or ban the chemical or pesticide when it is found to present unreasonable risk. So first you have the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. And that is the law that regulates all pesticides, including herbicides like paraquat. And Patti is going to be discussing FIFRA more. You also have the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FFDCA. And that law regulates chemicals that are used as food additives and food packaging, used in pharmaceuticals, and used in cosmetics. And then you have the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, which regulates almost everything else. There are approximately 40,000 chemicals that are subject to regulation under TSCA, and I'm going to be discussing that law in particular. So this is really an important area of law, and it's a statistic that I give in all of these presentations, and still kind of somewhat shocks me. There are approximately 30,000 pounds of chemicals produced or imported for each person in the United States every year. We just use and release massive amounts of industrial chemicals. And some of these chemicals, obviously, there are lots of different chemicals. Some have far more serious effects than others. But we know that many of these chemicals, including chlorinated solvents like trichloroethylene, TCE, and perchloroethylene, PCE, have been linked to Parkinson's disease and other neurological harm. And here on the side of the screen, I have a picture of Camp Lejeune. As many of you may know, Camp Lejeune was the site of really one of the nation's kind of worst instances of TCE contamination. It's a military base where there were just uncontrolled releases of TCE that contaminated the drinking water and turned really the surrounding area into a federal Superfund site that is still being actively remediated. It's also a site where Brian Grant spent some time during his childhood. So how are chemicals regulated under TSCA? There are three main steps that chemicals go through. First, there's what's known as a prioritization process, where EPA picks chemicals that it wants to regulate, that it wants to evaluate, chemicals that EPA wants to study. And to be prioritized under TSCA, EPA has to just make an initial determination that the chemical may present an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. And then once a chemical is prioritized, it goes through a multi-year risk evaluation process. And that process is intended to look at all the uses of the chemical, look at all the exposures that those uses result in, and then determine whether the chemical presents an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. And if it does, if EPA makes that finding, EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency here. It's the kind of main federal agency that implements TSCA and that oversees chemical regulation. If EPA finds that a chemical presents unreasonable risk, then the chemical goes into a separate process known as risk management, where EPA has to regulate the chemical to the extent necessary so that it no longer presents such risk. And I'll be discussing kind of these various steps in a little bit greater detail, but what's really critical is this risk evaluation process, because EPA, when it's deciding whether to regulate a chemical and how much to regulate a chemical, it really depends on the risks that EPA finds in a risk evaluation. EPA only needs to regulate and eliminate the risks that it identifies as unreasonable. So kind of the law says, and this is a quote, and again, you're going to see a lot of the elements of this quote kind of raise their own questions, that EPA must conduct risk evaluations to determine whether a chemical substance presents an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment, including an unreasonable risk to a potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulation. And without getting into too much detail, because any of these kind of sub-questions that are listed on the side really could be kind of the topic of their own presentation, this means that EPA not only has to look at risks to the general population, but it also has to look at risks to groups of people who, by virtue of greater exposure or greater susceptibility, are more likely to be harmed by the chemical. And I think that's critically important because you inevitably have, and again, you'll see this under FIFRA, but also under the pesticides law, but also under TSCA, certain workers, farm workers in the case of pesticides, many industrial workers and chemical manufacturing workers in the case of kind of other chemicals have greater exposures to these chemicals. They're just exposed to them day in, day out, far more frequently and in greater amounts than the general public. And many groups of people have either genetic conditions or pre-existing conditions or other risk factors that make them more likely to be harmed by the chemical. And we've seen that with Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease, people who are exposed to paraquat that have certain just genetic traits, kind of certain genetic, what are known as polymorphisms, are far more likely to get Parkinson's disease from their paraquat use and exposure than people who lack that same genetic structure. So TCE was one of the initial chemicals that EPA evaluated under the Toxic Substances Control Act. This law was amended by Congress in 2016. EPA has conducted 10 risk evaluations since then. And one of those 10 chemicals was TCE. And this first quote is a quote from the risk evaluation, where EPA found that several newer epidemiological studies, these are studies of people, found an association between TCE exposure and neurodegenerative disorders such as ALS and Parkinson's disease. So EPA has acknowledged that kind of in studies of people, you're seeing a connection between TCE and Parkinson's disease. And this is really significant for TCE because of these second kind of and third points. This is a chemical where, and these are not from EPA, these last kind of two bullets are from the CDC, but there are an estimated 1.8 million pounds of TCE released to the air every year from 154 domestic manufacturing and processing facilities. So this is a chemical that is released in just very large volumes to the air. And it is a chemical that is detected, depending on where you get your water from, in between 5 and 15% of drinking water supplies. So you have really broad exposures, both from the air and from water, to this chemical that has been associated with Parkinson's disease and other neurological harm. Now, having found that TCE is connected to Parkinson's disease and a range of other very serious health effects, what does EPA do with that? EPA made a finding of unreasonable risk for TCE, and it now is required to regulate the chemical to the extent necessary so that it no longer presents such risk. And there are a number of tools that EPA can use to do this. It can ban the chemical, it can ban specific uses of the chemical, it can limit the amount of the chemical that can be released to air or water. It can establish a workplace exposure limit, so people that work in a factory or in a kind of indoor facility cannot be exposed to more than a certain amount of the chemical. It can regulate the chemical's disposal. There really are a suite of options that are available to EPA under TSCA, but the overriding mandate is one of public health protection. EPA has to get rid of unreasonable risk. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for the public to participate in this process. I mentioned the chemicals go through prioritization, risk evaluation, risk management. At each of those stages, there is the opportunity for what is known as notice and comment. EPA publishes its proposed prioritization decisions, its draft risk evaluation, its proposed regulations for public review. And it gives a period of time where people can write in, submit comments on the risk evaluation if EPA has failed to adequately consider the chemical's health effects, as we think that it did for paraquat. You can submit comments and let them know, actually, there's a lot of data out there that you're not giving sufficient kind of credence to, or that you missed. And if people think that the risk evaluation rule, the risk management rule or the regulation does not go far enough, then people can say that as well. People can say, look, this is a highly toxic chemical, which is affecting millions of people. EPA needs to go further. EPA needs to ban the chemical under TSCA, revoke its registration under FIFRA. EPA needs to do more to protect the public. EPA often holds public meetings under TSCA where people can present oral comments. There is, under the statute, a petition process where interested organizations or members of the public can ask EPA to evaluate or to regulate a particular chemical. And these opportunities are actually really important. Kind of when public comments are submitted, the agency has to respond to them. In litigation, kind of where ultimately if EPA does not go far enough, if EPA allows continued exposures, continued uses of the chemical, and people want to go to court to challenge that, the public comments provide the foundation for that litigation. They are really the basis on which the court will review the agency's decision. So I think that we are, as Earth Justice, frequently engaged in commenting on risk evaluations and proposed rules. We often circulate those comments for kind of sign-on by interested organizations, and we're happy to work with anybody that has a question about a proposed rule, chemical that might be being evaluated by EPA. But we really are interested in kind of elevating voices of impacted groups and impacted people, and ensuring that the agency understands the effects that its evaluations and decisions are having. So that is my overview of non-pesticide chemical regulation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to my colleague Patti, who will discuss her experience and really kind of tremendous victory with regard to the regulation of a particular pesticide.
Hello, I am Patti Goldman. I'm a senior attorney with Earth Justice. Let me share my screen. Did I do it? Can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, looks good.
All right, great. So I'm going to tell a story about another pesticide and kind of like the anatomy of an advocacy campaign, actually two different campaigns related to this pesticide. And what I'm hoping to do is like have you see how you can make a difference. A successful advocacy campaign blends all sorts of tools, communications, legal action, science, commenting, advocating to state legislatures, to Congress, and all of these can have impact combined. So I'm going to talk about, there we go, a pesticide called chlorpyrifos. My colleagues who are media professionals struggled at the beginning with how do you tell the story when people can't even pronounce this pesticide. They started calling it chlor-P as a way to avoid, people can talk about it then without worrying how they're pronouncing it. But what is the story? And the story of chlorpyrifos is that it is one of many in a class of pesticides called organophosphates. These pesticides were developed as nerve gas weapons by the Nazis in World War II. And when the Nazi state broke up, they were adapted for commercial use as pesticides. There were about 4 dozen used in the United States. They hit anything with the nervous system, and not surprisingly, given how they were developed, they harm people when people are exposed. They cause acute poisonings, much like paraquat. And what we've learned over time is they also cause learning disabilities and other permanent damage to children's brains at very low level exposures. So that's the story. There's stories of paraquat too, that what is this pesticide? So I'm going to talk about 2 campaigns. One took a lot less time than the other, and that was to protect people and children in particular from pesticide drift. So another part of the story of chlorpyrifos is that in 2000, EPA banned the use of this pesticide in the homes. It was used as an insecticide in the homes. EPA had a mandate to protect children. They modeled kids and when they crawl around on the ground and how much they put their hands in their mouth or when they hug their pets, and found that kids were just at extreme risk from this pesticide in their home, only looking at acute poisonings. But they didn't address farm worker kids and other people who are near the fields. So one of our clients and partners, Pesticide Action Network, started a community science program They developed a drift catcher, which could be placed in schoolyards or neighborhoods to monitor pesticide drift. And it was easy to use. They trained community members to administer the monitoring program. And they found chlorpyrifos and other toxic pesticides at schools and in neighborhoods in toxic amounts. So they gave this information to the California Air Resources Board, which then started doing its own air monitoring and confirmed the findings. And this was really powerful to have the findings verified. Then we petitioned EPA with this information to protect people from pesticide drift. These photos are from farm worker housing in Oregon, where you can see the fields, the fruit trees are right next to people's homes. The petition eventually led EPA to acknowledge its responsibility to protect children from pesticide drift. And for chlorpyrifos, it established no spray buffer zones around schools, homes, daycares, hospitals, other places where people gather. And this is now becoming standard practice. It's far too slow, but we're starting to get these implemented for other pesticides as they're being reviewed by EPA. So the next campaign was to protect children from learning disabilities. And here we start again with science. So back in the mid-1990s, there was a pivotal National Academy of Sciences report that chastised EPA for regulating pesticides based on an adult, healthy white man. And what this report did is look at children and say, children aren't like adults. They do different things. They eat different foods. They drink more liquids and put their hands in their mouth more than we do. And that led to a legal requirement that EPA look at children and protect children from pesticides and every age of children. But it also led to a series of children's health centers. And several of them studied the organophosphates and chlorpyrifos in particular, like the ones at Columbia, Berkeley, and Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And they studied mother-child pairs, and the mothers were exposed in their pregnancies, and then they followed the children throughout their lives. The kids are late teens and early 20s now. And based on this, they found in numerous peer-reviewed published studies that the kids had statistically significant increases in autism, attention deficit disorder, developmental delays, and they had a reduction in IQ, 2 points. So we put this information in front of EPA through a petition in 2007, wanting EPA to protect kids from this kind of harm. EPA had only looked at the acute poisoning harms. We had to sue numerous times to get EPA to act. Sometimes it would be just when we'd ask the court to give EPA a deadline, EPA then would do the next level of its analysis. And as part of that, EPA convened its scientific advisory panel on several occasions. And the panel confirmed that these pesticides are causing learning disabilities in children at exposures far below those that cause acute poisonings. And we had a pivotal change in 2014 when EPA acknowledged these findings. It made these findings officially in a risk assessment, and it found that drinking water is unsafe, as are the exposures to workers, and that they could cause harm to the children. We then had more deadlines. EPA proposed to end food uses of chlorpyrifos based on these drinking water risks. And then when EPA tried to find a safe level for children, it found chlorpyrifos unsafe every way children are exposed. We had a court deadline of March of 2017, but elections matter. We had an election. Scott Pruitt was the new EPA administrator, and his first act was to say he was not going to ban chlorpyrifos. He denied our petition and said he wanted to study the science more. There were uncertainties. There are always uncertainties. We obtained another court deadline. In 2019, EPA said the same thing. They weren't going to ask. There were too many uncertainties. And they were particularly troubled by how do you use epidemiology in regulating. Typically, EPA has industry studies where there's a dose, that causes harm to laboratory animals, you know the dose. But with epidemiology, you know that harm exists, but you often don't know the dose. We knew it was at levels that did not cause acute poisoning, but we couldn't pinpoint the dose. So EPA was in inaction mode. Meanwhile, many states started to step into the void. And this is important because of the way the advocacy builds on each other. California has the most sophisticated apparatus to analyze pesticide harms. They did their own risk assessments. They found that chlorpyrifos causes learning disabilities in children and found it unsafe. And they started a cancellation action. That's the official way to say a pesticide can't be used. As that was proceeding, Dow, which is now called Corteva, was facing discovery, the process by which they were going to have to turn over their internal information, which would show what they knew and when. And they didn't want to do that. So they said they were going to end almost all of the uses in California, and they stopped making chlorpyrifos. Other states adopted bans as well. We were getting this patchwork of bans at the state level. We also had the legislation that Ted talked about that had a provision to ban chlorpyrifos. It wasn't going to pass, we knew that, but it was a vehicle for the leaders in Congress on this issue to speak out and for people to be heard. And so it was very activating and educational. And then the other type of litigation that we have on chlorpyrifos, and we also have on paraquat, is people who are harmed suing for compensation. Families whose children have learning disabilities were suing Dow Corteva for harm. And those cases as well are leading to discovery. And you get to a point where the company doesn't want to disclose what it knew and when, and also they face big jury awards. And that is a big driver in helping that change happen. So we in court, we finally had a victory. The Ninth Circuit, which is where the case was heard, said that EPA could not retain tolerances, which is what allows the pesticide to be used on our food, unless it could find that chlorpyrifos was safe. It said on the record before EPA, the only reasonable conclusion is that chlorpyrifos is not safe. And it gave EPA 60 days to either end all uses or end as many as it needed to make sure that the food would be safe. I saw there was a question in the chat, what happens if the paraquat case is successful? It would be what happened here with the matter sent back to EPA to do it over and do it right. This particular decision was particularly strong because we were under the food law that has a stronger legal standard of protection. And we also had many panels of the Ninth Circuit had heard this case. And the delay had been documented in many court decisions. In April, the Ninth Circuit said, EPA's egregious delay exposed a generation of American children to unsafe levels of chlorpyrifos. So you might have thought this was over, that we had won, but we had that period of time. 60 days was actually a little longer. It doesn't start for a few months, but in that period of time from April to August, many of our clients and partners met with the leadership at EPA. And this is where having a lot of voices heard made a big difference. Many of our partners work with farm workers and could tell the story of the farm workers who've been impacted, some with labor leaders, including of national education associations. We had teachers who could talk about the impacts of learning disabilities on children. We had a Learning Disabilities Association of America, again, could talk about the hardships of learning disabilities. All of these stories were so compelling. I had to like wipe tears away from my eyes as I was hearing these stories. They were very impactful. I don't know what decision EPA would have made without them, but I know that these stories had impact. And EPA did revoke all the tolerances. The chlorpyrifos will be completely out of our food, both food grown in the US and imported by February 28th. EPA still needs to act on the non-food uses, but they're really minor compared to other food uses, and we hope they'll do the right thing. Now, as I said at the beginning, chlorpyrifos is one in a class of these neurotoxic pesticides. They all cause the same types of harms, acute poisonings and learning disabilities to children. EPA has some draft risk assessments on all of them, finding them unsafe, whether it's in food or drinking water or both, or workers, and it hasn't acted on them. So we've petitioned again to EPA to ban the organophosphate pesticides, and we're starting this process over. And I hope this helps you see ways you can engage and how people coming together can have impact. It's the only way it's ever been done, when people really push for this type of action. Thank you. If I can stop sharing. Okay, great.
Thank you guys so much for those awesome presentations. We had a few questions. I do want to give Ted some time to also talk a little bit about state advocacy efforts that are coming up for the Parkinson's community, because I do hope that the people on this presentation today are inspired to help those efforts and make sure that we can have victories like we had with chlorpyrifos. I really love that presentation, Patti. One question I had as we were talking about it is, when you talk about the epidemiological studies that are showing these associations and links, who's doing those studies? Does the burden fall on the public to figure that out?
Well, the ones for chlorpyrifos were done by academic institutions that were funded by National Institutes of Environmental Health.
Okay.
To study children. And I think that, I mean, these are expensive studies, and you want them to be done state of the art. It's hard that agencies are not used to integrating epidemiology into their regulation. And so you want to have the most credible kinds of studies that will show that link, and, you know, hopefully they're peer reviewed, published studies that will withstand the kind of scrutiny they're going to get. You know, what Dow Cortez did is try to hire a lot of different scientists that are consultants, you know, for industry for this purpose, to try to poke holes in these studies. And you need them to be able to stand up to that scrutiny.
That's great. And one of the questions we did get was more of a comment about trying, if we could share the references to some of those studies that you alluded, that you showed in your presentation. Because I think we're all really interested in reading what the epidemiology had to say. So thank you guys so much for all of that. I do, like I said, want to make sure we have some time for Ted to talk about state policy efforts, but I'm going to go ahead and go through a few of the questions we did get. One of the questions we got was regarding the paraquat lawsuit. If it's successful, what will that require the EPA to do?
So I can take a first stab at this one, and please, Patti, feel free to kind of join in or add anything that I don't mention. So under federal law, pesticides have to be registered before they can use. EPA has to approve their use, and it imposes certain conditions on their use. And those registrations have to be reviewed at least once every 15 years. So what EPA just did is it reevaluated paraquat. We think that it did so in a flawed way, in a way that didn't adequately account for the risks and the connection between paraquat and Parkinson's disease. But based upon that reevaluation, it reapproved the registration of paraquat. It basically authorized the continued use of paraquat for another 15 years. We are asking the court to send that registration back to EPA, to what is known as remand the registration, with directions to, as Patti mentioned, do things differently, to correct some of the flaws that we will present in our brief, including the failure to adequately account for Parkinson's disease risks, and the failure to meaningfully balance all the risks that EPA found with what EPA basically, it acknowledged there were risks, and it said, yes, but this herbicide is saving growers money, and therefore it found that the benefits of paraquat outweighed the risks. And we don't think that was based on a holistic and meaningful comparison. So we're going to be asking EPA to correct that as well. And we think that once EPA looks at all the information, takes another look at the evidence, it will need to impose much stronger controls. And it may, as many countries have chosen to do, have to actually eliminate this registration, to kind of disapprove paraquat's registration and effectively ban the pesticide. But at a minimum, EPA will need to go back, do things differently, and make new decisions based upon a more kind of comprehensive look at the evidence.
Thank you for that. We had a comment just now, somebody thanking Earth Justice for your work, and I think we all can agree with that. You are doing really great work, and I appreciate Ted and what he's doing as well. You know, a question we got two different questions that are kind of on the same track. We get a lot at the foundation too. If I grew up on a farm or in a rural area and I thought maybe I was exposed to a chemical linked to Parkinson's, is there a way for me to find that out or to look that up? Probably not an easy way.
So often people don't know what they've been exposed to. So I guess the question would be, do you know what you were exposed to? And then you can find out, well, what is it associated with? But most of the folks that I work don't know what they were exposed to. Now, I know this did come up in Oregon, where an individual who has Parkinson's had asked, was this used where I worked in the fields? And the folks that work on pesticide issues and represent farm workers in Oregon knew that what had been used by a lot of the different growers. But that only tells you what was used by some growers or in an area. You also saw the map had pulled up, which shows where paraquat's used. So you could look at that kind of reporting to see, was that used where I have been exposed? But it's there's not mandatory use reporting of pesticides except for in California. So it's really hard to get that information.
Okay, thank you for that. We did somebody did also ask us about water treatment chemicals in Parkinson's. Do you know anything about whether chemicals used to treat water are linked to Parkinson's disease? It's probably a similar question. It's really hard to know unless you know the chemical.
Yeah, on that one, I don't think that any of us are qualified to answer.
Okay.
It would be a Parkinson's researcher. But to the last question, Patti made the point that the mandatory reporting of pesticide usage doesn't exist in most of the United States. There is a pesticide registry in California, and there should be many more. But let me have that dovetail into how we're going to approach this at the state level. One could push for just an all-out ban, but that is not an easy thing to do at a state-by-state level. So one of the things that we are exploring is what we're calling transparency legislation, a requirement that pesticide applicators report where they are applying it, and that data should be made publicly available. It doesn't prohibit the use of it. It doesn't put new restrictions. It does nothing but create transparency. And that way, the public and lawmakers can look to see how much of specific pesticides are being used in their backyard. And from a research perspective, researchers will be able to do a much more targeted epidemiological research in those geographic regions to get even further evidence of the triggering effect of, in this case, Parkinson's or of paraquat. But we think that a transparency bill to educate the public and lawmakers, because honestly, this should not be a partisan issue whatsoever. And given that these are used in very rural areas, the more we can tie paraquat to Parkinson's increased incidence in those communities, I think the more likely, the better the chance we have to get states to take action, as opposed to just coming in saying you should ban it and here's some scientific studies. Now, if the EPA does its job and reverses its reapproval, then this is all for naught as it pertains to paraquat. But it could pertain to some of the other chemicals that we've identified, like TCE, PFAS, the forever chemicals. There is a connection to Parkinson's, and that too has been a stalled effort at the federal level. My understanding is that the Obama administration had basically put into motion a plan to ultimately ban these forever chemicals. Then there was a 4-year hiatus to that effort, and my understanding is that that effort has been renewed, but it has got a lot more attention. But there are a lot of different diseases and health conditions relevant to the PFAS chemicals.
So those so the transparency ads or the transparency laws that are those just starting on the state advocacy level, Ted? Are there ways for people to keep informed?
Yeah, the best way would be initially to sign up on our webpage for advocacy updates. I will say that there was a bill introduced in Virginia that would have required applicators to report to the state, but the new governor of Virginia, and some farming interests immediately came out against it. The bill was referred to the Agriculture Committee and summarily killed. So, the first effort at that, just get information, was stopped in Virginia. We're actually talking with our friends in California about that type of an effort. So this probably won't be initially a 50-state initiative. We're going to do it in a targeted approach. And I will let you know that in Virginia, the idea didn't come from us. It came from an American Parkinson's Disease Association connection. But it triggered for us, hey, this is a great idea. It's another approach we can take. There's the old phrase that sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. And, this is an example of that.
Yeah, that's great. So I just want to make sure everybody knows, Ted, we were talking about going to the Michael J. Fox Foundation website. And when you're on the Michael J. Fox Foundation website, you can sign up for advocacy updates. And that's the best way to know about efforts that are coming up and ways to get involved.
Right. And if you are really interested, and I'll go further, if you are really interested in taking on some of these issues and getting involved, it's more than just a passive, I'm going to get involved, but want to actually do something. Email policy@michaeljfox.org. That is monitored. Julia is our state government relations person. She is highly energetic. We, in fact, had hoped to introduce 2 or 3 Parkinson's registry bills this year, and I think she's got 7 bills moving in Ohio, Hawaii, West Virginia, South Carolina, Maryland, and I might be missing one state. So there's a lot of activity around the Parkinson's registries, which again, that's data collection that is going to advance the science, both on these environmental triggers and just Parkinson's in general.
Yeah, so for people listening, that we're very proud to be a partner with UPAC, the United Parkinson's Advocacy Council, and Ted run through the Michael J. Fox Foundation, quite a few policy people working at the Michael J. Fox Foundation to help these efforts. So if you're not aware of that, we're grateful to be a part of it and grateful to Ted for being here. I also wanted to say, I think it's fantastic that you've teamed up with Earth Justice. And can I just ask, how did that connection come about?
It's kind of like dating, you forget the first date. Another one of my staff was working on this issue, and the more she dug, and then I think she found she knew of Earth Justice, but she brought Earth Justice to our attention, and we started to engage in conversation. And I'm ashamed to say that I wasn't really aware of Earth Justice before this, but I'm one of their biggest fans now, and I just think they do great work on behalf of the environment. More critical now than ever. So, but that's an example of, we look to partner. I mean, we partner with groups on all sorts of issues, and where we have a common agenda or common mission, we want to move forward. And that's, I'm in a unique position. I work for the Michael J. Fox Foundation, but all the work that I and my team does isn't really related to the foundation. It's only related to people with Parkinson's and their caregivers. So we are here working on behalf of the entire community. We don't have our own Michael J. Fox policy platforms. Everything we do is derived from the community for the community. And I think this, and the partnership with Earth Justice, just, most of the policy work is done in the legislative branch, but this is a judicial branch action. And it's not unusual to sue the federal government if they've made a bad decision. And so this is another form of advocacy, which is using the judicial system to try and right what we believe is a wrong.
That's so great. And I do want to say, for the people who don't know about, again, UPAC and the work that Ted and his team are doing, behind the scenes, they're doing a lot of work on behalf of the Parkinson's community and on everything from access to care to research funding to environmental justice for people with Parkinson's. So a lot of really good work happening from Ted and his team. And again, really proud to be a partner with you guys. We just have a few more minutes. So I just wanted to ask if you guys had any kind of parting thoughts for our viewers, particularly around what might be coming up that should be on their radar, besides the paraquat.
I'd like to respond. I saw that there was a comment in the chat about the advertisements for who are doing the compensation cases.
Sure.
And definitely that is a very legitimate thing to do. And what EPA did not say, there's no link between paraquat and Parkinson's. It said there's some evidence, but not enough that it's happening at the levels of exposure that EPA would be allowing. That's where it was with chlorpyrifos. It just took a long time for EPA to credit the scientific evidence and find that correlation. And so we're like one step behind where the chlorpyrifos started to turn the corner. But these private lawyers, they're digging into the science. They have incredible experts. They're able to take the depositions, which are interviews under oath of folks that work at the company. So they're putting together a lot of information to prove the causation. And so I definitely don't take what EPA did as closing the door on those kinds of remedies.
Thank you for that. Thank you for we've had that question emailed to us as well. And I know that UPAC members have also discussed inquiries about those lawsuits as well. Jonathan, did you want to add something?
I agree with all of that entirely. I was just going to add something a little bit different, which is about TCE. So bringing it back to kind of some other chemicals, there will be revisions to the TCE risk evaluation that are proposed. The Biden administration is currently working on those, and those we expect to see over the next year. Kind of the timing is a little bit uncertain. And then following that, there will be a proposed TCE regulation where kind of the government will determine what uses TCE is allowed to or how TCE is allowed to continue to be used, whether kind of any major uses, whether it's dry cleaning or degreasing or others, will be banned or prohibited. And I think all of that is just going to be kind of prime opportunities for engagement. So we're happy to keep kind of the Brian Grant Foundation informed of any development.
Yes, we do.
Kind of happy to answer any questions that you or your partners and members may have.
Yeah, thank you so much. We absolutely want to be a partner in this. We also believe that these issues are incredibly important, not just for people with Parkinson's today, but for everybody who may have developed the disease and everybody else, to be honest. But I just want to say thank you guys for being here. Please do keep us informed of any efforts that we can help with. Earth Justice and Michael J. Fox Foundation both have ways to sign up and get involved with their organizations if you would like to check out their websites as well. And thank you guys so much to everybody listening. Please join us next month. We will be talking with Delaram Sathapur from OHSU about nutrition for Parkinson's. That's up on our website at briangrant.org/events. And with that, I just want to again say thank you guys for joining. I hope this is one of many. I hope this is one of many webcasts we will do on this topic. So thank you so much. And thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.